Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to Day 3 of official Aether Revolt previews. Now, much like Day 1 and Day 2, we have a lot of cards to talk about, so I don't want to waste too much time. We'll cut to the chase. Quickly, before we get started though, if you check out the description below, you'll see some links to our Amazon affiliate store where you can purchase many Magic products, including Aether Revolt products. Small percentage will come back to the channel if you do that. There's also links down there for our Patreon page, and that's another great way to help support us and help us keep doing what we're doing, making these videos for you. So having said that, let's get into the cards. And the first thing we're going to look at today actually is a card that was leaked a couple weeks ago now. So we talked about this at length in another video, so I won't go over it all again. But this has now been officially confirmed by Wizards of the Coast. Disallow is truly a thing. And we're going to talk a little more about this card in a few minutes when we look at another card. So do take note of it if nothing else. Next, we have a card that comes to us from a Japanese language spoiler, and it is Call for Unity. Now, keep in mind with these translated spoilers, and we do have a lot of them today, that sometimes there could be small mistakes in the translation. But this one, 2 white and 3, enchantment, Revolt. At the beginning of your end step, put a Unity counter on Call for Unity if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, and creatures you control get +1/+1 for each Unity counter on Call for Unity. So typically I'm not a big fan of enchantments that cost 4 or 5 or more and don't do anything on their own when they come into play, and this does fall into that category. Now granted, if you can trigger Revolt on the turn you play it, then wonderful. At your end step, this gets a counter. All your creatures get +1/+1, so that's not the worst thing in the world, but I do think this is a little bit slow for the current standard environment. And let's face it, there's a lot of great ways to give your creatures right now +1/+1 counters or anthem effects. I mean, Gideon's in the format, right? So this feels much too slow when you compare it to cards like that, at least currently. Having said that though, I think this could be okay for you in limited under certain circumstances. As long as you can consistently hit the Revolt and you have enough creatures to benefit from this, it's not a bad draft pick there. And I think you could also have a little bit of fun with this in a commander deck. There are a lot of things that are actually pretty interesting about this card and its design. So I like where they're going with this, but like I said, I think it's just a little bit too slow for current standard. There's other places you can play it though. Next we have Exquisite Ark Angel. This is a card spoiled by Wedge from the Mana Source. Costs 2 white and 5. It's a mythic angel, 5/5 with flying. If you would lose the game, instead exile this, and your life total becomes equal to your starting life total. This is interesting to me. Okay, think of this. What if you're playing a Selesnya ramp deck, trying to ramp into Emrakul, and you throw one of these out along the way as a stumbling block for your opponent? They're going to have to deal with this at some point. It's going to eat up one of their removal cards. It's interesting, right? I mean, I don't know if it'd be fast enough. I don't know if it'd be consistent enough in standard, especially considering how fast standard is right now. But I'd like to try it. Like, I feel like there's definitely some potential there. 7 doesn't feel like this thing is priced out of control considering the amount of ramp we've seen already in the set. So, I don't know. Just something to think about. Other than that, yeah, Commander, this would be awesome, right? This is just another really fun Commander card. 7 is very easy to cast there. Again, there's going to be a lot of opponents gunning for it early in the game because there's so many people at the table that could have answers to it. But later in the game, when you're down to the last opponent or two, this could be a pretty big stumbling block for them putting away the game. So I actually like it there quite a bit. Regardless though, if nothing else, if this turns out to be a fun Commander card with amazing art, that might be good enough, but there's definitely potential there. Next we have Solemn Recruit, 2 white and 1. It's a dwarf soldier with double strike. It's a 2/2. As Revolt, at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Solemn Recruit. And this came to us from a Spanish language spoiler. Now, this card plays really well with the last card we looked at, right? So if you had both of those in play and you hit the Revolt trigger, then at the end step, this thing becomes a 4/4. That's actually kind of awesome, right? 4/4 double striker. So that's pretty cool. I will say this, though, about this card. This is another card that feels like it would be pretty good in limited. I wouldn't mind picking it. It can potentially put a lot of damage across, especially if you can hit the Revolt trigger consistently. But again, I think it's going to be a little too slow for standard. Now, one of the reasons I say that is because casting cost, double white and 1, isn't always efficient enough in the current standard environment, I don't think. And also, we haven't seen it yet, but we're about to look at a card that really takes the stock down in a lot of 2 toughness creatures. And this thing is a 2 toughness creature at the very least until your end step. So you do have to take that into account unless you have something else on the battlefield that can immediately bolster it. Next we have Aethertide Whale. This costs 2 blue and 4. It's a whale with flying, and when this enters the battlefield, you get 6 energy, pay 4 energy, and you can return it to your hand. It's a 6/4, and this comes to us from a Russian language spoiler. So I looked at this card, and the first thing I thought to myself was, are they bringing back intro packs? Because this really felt like an intro pack rare to me. Of course, that's not the case, but it just has that feel. And I don't hate intro pack rares. I think they're actually very good limited cards, and that's what this is. This is a very good limited card. Like, I'm happy to play this. I'll pay 6 for a 6/4 flyer. Even if that's all it did, I would be fine with that in limited, and I'm on board. Also, it does give you a fair amount of energy. I mean, 6 energy when this enters the battlefield, and the ability to protect itself a little bit or trigger revolt is interesting, if nothing else. So it does a lot for you in limited, but I think it's a little bit too expensive, maybe a little slow and clunky for standard, but still, cool limited card. I'd be happy to play it. Next we have a card that comes to us from a Chinese simplified spoiler. It's Airship Bandit. It costs a blue and 1. It's a human pirate with flying, 2/1. And whenever this deals combat damage to a player, you choose target permanent or player. Give the target another counter of a kind already there. So, interesting card here. First off, yes, it's a little bit fragile. It's a 2/1. And that's awkward with the ability a little bit, because really what you want to do with this card is attack in, do damage to an opponent, and copy a counter on something. And do notice, take note that this actually can be any permanent or player. So that's a wide variety of different things that you can target. That includes planeswalkers, and a lot of times they deliberately exclude planeswalkers in these type of cards. But you can increase loyalty counters on a planeswalker. You can hit things like poison counters on a player, experience counters on a player, energy counters, +1/+1 counters on a creature, charge counters on an artifact, -1/-1 counters on a creature, you name it. There's a whole list of things that this card becomes more intriguing when it's played with, right? Some people would compare this to Proliferate or even to Thrumming Bird. I do think it's a little bit different in a way, because you do have to remember when it comes to Proliferate, you actually got to choose any number of targets at that time, which this is only letting you choose 1 target. That's a big difference. So this isn't quite as good as Thrumming Bird in that regard. Thrumming Bird, you can choose any number of players or permanents on the battlefield. So if you're playing a big commander game, you could just go crazy with counters. Not necessarily the case here. The other thing that's a little awkward about this card is, again, it's a 2/1 flyer. Early on, it's great because you probably can get some damage across, but early on, you might not have any targets to target with counters on them. Later on, when you have cards or counters on people, you probably won't be able to get this 2/1 flyer across, and that's where this gets kind of strange. Having said that, I think this is still fine in limited. I don't mind playing a 2/1 flyer for 2 in limited. The 2-drop spot is maybe your most important spot in limited, and having a creature with evasion that can get some early damage across can win you the game sometimes. So I have no problem playing this in limited and even picking it fairly high, but I'm doing it more so because of its stats and probably less so because of its ability. The ability is a nice bonus, and every once in a while it will work out for you. All right, here's the big one of the day. This is my pick of the day here. Baral, Chief of Compliance. This was spoiled by Channel Fireball. The article is by Luis Scott Vargas. You know that they're giving Channel Fireball and Luis some pretty serious cards, and this is no exception. 1 blue and 1, legendary creature, human wizard, 1/3. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. Okay, where do I begin with this? First off, we talked about disallow at the top of the show. Well, if this is in play, disallow is actually now better than counterspell. So there you have it. That's how good this card is, and all the things that this card can do for a control deck are mind-blowing, quite honestly. Control in Standard. Let's start there with Standard. Control in Standard, I think, can be a thing. This card took the strong potential of seeing a standard control deck and probably moved into almost the likelihood of seeing a standard control deck. It's not a matter of if, but now a matter of when. And I think we'll see one, maybe not right off the bat, first couple weeks of standard, but I think once you start getting a month into standard or more, there's going to be some control decks out there. They're going to be running this card. And I could see a heavy blue control deck that's also messing around with artifacts a little bit. I think that's what will eventually come into the meta game at some point. Beyond standard, this card's awesome. It's going to be played everywhere. Vintage, this is good. Legacy, this is good. Modern, this is good. Commander, this is great. Oh, by the way, this can be your commander. It's legendary. Put this in a cube if you have a control element in your cube. I mean, you're going to be able to play this card everywhere. This is incredible. Maybe one of the best cards we've seen so far from the set. Definitely the best card today by far. And I'm excited to try it out. I don't know what else I can really say about it. I just think it's going to be in a lot of different places. Look at it this way. It's kind of like the anti-Thalia in some ways. And Thalia is a huge card in Legacy and even Vintage. This card is going to show up to counteract that effect in those places too. This is just awesome. Now we have Burrells Expertise. 2 blue and 3. It's a sorcery. Return up to 3 target artifact and or creature cards to their owner's hands. You may cast a card with converted mana cost 4 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. Alright, these expertise spells are kind of awesome too. Whenever you get to play free spells, and that's basically what these cards do for you, in the history of Magic, we've seen that that can be very, very powerful, at times even broken. I don't necessarily think these interactions are broken, but they do feel very, very powerful for the current standard. And this card, no exception, just like the other ones we've seen so far, it could be great. And you have to really think about how they work together even. You can see some crazy chain of events happen with some of these expertise cards in play. For this one, for example, quickly, you can do so much with this. I mean, first off, you could simply return a bunch of creatures to your opponent's hand and then just use this as a tempo play and cast something for casting cost or less for free after that. That's a pretty big move in its own. But imagine if you had a pretty good board state, you attacked in with a bunch of things, hit your opponent, then you go ahead and play this, return your creatures back to your hand, and maybe play something like Hihini's Expertise, give everything left on the battlefield -3/-3, and then you get to put one of your creatures back down again for free. That's kind of a crazy chain that you could actually see happen now in Standard. That's insane, right? So look for these type of interactions to be a part of Standard in some degree. Now, maybe you're not going to see this as a complete theme of a deck, but definitely a sub-theme in some decks that are going to help give those decks an extra punch for sure. Next, we have a card that comes to us from a Japanese language spoiler, and the translation was pretty nailed down, but they did not have the name of it, partially due to the blurriness of the photo there. So it was still pretty solid, so I wanted to show it to you. It's a black and 2. We'll just call it Aetherborn Warrior for right now because that is the creature type. It's a 3/2. It has Revolt, and when this enters the battlefield, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. So this is actually a pinpoint removal spell that's recurable for small creatures, and that's actually pretty awesome. So it costs 3. It's a 3/2, so its stats are pretty decent too to begin with. But it is 2 toughness, so yes, it is a little bit fragile. You have to take that into account. And I know I've alluded to this earlier, but pretty soon we're going to see a card that was spoiled today that is really going to be tough on some of those 2 toughness creatures. And you'll know what I'm talking about in a second here. But other than that, though, this is still a good card. I think it's good enough to see some standard play just because of its utility. And it's great for you limited. I mean, this is an awesome limited card. Definitely a very high pick for sure. And do take note, it's an uncommon. So there'll be a number of these floating around in limited. Secret Salvage. This one costs 2 black and 3. It's a sorcery. Exile target non-land card from your graveyard. Search your library for any number of cards with the same name as that card. Reveal them, put them into your hand, shuffle. Alright, so this card is kind of fun. This was spoiled by Saffron Olive, who does MTG Goldfish. And if you're familiar with his work, he does a lot of crazy deck techs. Like, one of his fortes is really doing really strong budget builds. A lot of these builds actually do cross over into strong standard decks and into actual constructed formats. So they gave him a card, I think, that was purposely kind of a fun brew card. And this card's very interesting. Like, there's definitely things you can do with it. He had a great article on this card on MTG Goldfish. I would suggest you check it out. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to say is just basically what he said in the article, quite honestly. But one interaction that immediately jumps to mind for some people that are trying to do something crazy with a brew is Hedron Alignment, right? Hedron Alignment's the card that kind of captured a lot of casual players' imaginations. Great kitchen table magic. This is a way to enable that. Now, I don't see this happening in Standard, right? Like, this is still a kitchen table thing, but it's still fun, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's definitely worth talking about. Another thing you could do with this, and he actually thought about a cool modern deck list that involves this card with Relentless Rats. So that's actually a very interesting interaction. And then he did go on to talk a little more about Commander and Shadowborn Apostle and how that interacts with this card and how that could be a really interesting Commander deck. So yeah, I like the card. I really like the design. I like the fact that they're making these fun cards that, okay, granted, probably will only see play in Commander, but they're also only making them cost about 5 mana instead of like 7 mana, right? In the past, we've seen these type of cards cost like 7 or 8 for some reason, and yeah, they're still playable in Commander at that cost, but I feel like it's cool to be able to play these in Commander at the 5 spot instead of like the 7 spot. So it's interesting design. It does feel like they're getting a little more lenient on some of these like cards that are meant for Commander, and I think that's pretty cool. Next, we have a German language card. It's Lightning Walker, 2 red and 3, Human Warrior, double strike haste. And when this attacks, you get 2 energy. Then you may pay 8 energy. If you do, untap all creatures you control. And after this phase, there's an additional combat phase, and it's a 2/2. Okay, here's my issue with this card. Again, very fragile with the 2 toughness. I think that's going to be an issue. I like double strike, and I think sometimes Wizards knows how powerful double strike can be, so they purposely keep it tempered a little bit. This is going to cost you 5. There's a chance that it could just immediately be taken out for 2 damage. And when you do attack in with it, great. Double strike haste, that's awesome. And yeah, you get energy out of it too. That's also a nice little cherry on top. But look at it this way. Even if you're able to pay the 8 energy to get the second combat phase, I mean, at least this particular card can just be chump blocked by a servo token, right? So if your opponent's got 2 servo tokens, they just save themselves the double strike damage that would be coming in from this thing. So without evasion and the fact that it's only 2 toughness, doesn't quite get there for me for like Standard, but I do think it's a good card for Limited. Like, I'd be happy to play this in Limited. Granted, some of the time it would get killed and not do anything, but the times that your opponent doesn't have an answer, it's going to do a lot of damage. If you have the energy to back it up, it could be a finisher. So I do think it's decent there, but aside from Limited, I don't see it doing a whole lot. Indomitable Creativity, maybe the best named card so far. 3 red and X. It's a sorcery. This one is a mythic. Destroy X target artifacts and or creatures. For each permanent destroyed this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of his or her library until an artifact or creature card is revealed and exiles that card. Those players put the exiled cards onto the battlefield shuffle. Okay, so this is kind of like super polymorph, right? But it is kind of hard to cast. I mean, 3 red and then X. So if you want to hit 1 target, it's a 3 red and 1. Okay, that could be difficult a lot of the time to actually happen. So I don't see this being a card that you're playing in Standard. Could you make it work in Limited? Yeah, as long as you're heavy enough red, I think this could be actually fine for you in Limited. It's mythic, you won't see it that much. But if you have a issue on the battlefield and you just have no other way to deal with it, you can polymorph. Hopefully your opponent won't hit anything worse. Or if you have a token on the battlefield, you want to turn that into something better, potentially. Yes, there's a level of variance, but you are going to go ahead and be able to do that to yourself too, so that's kind of nice. The casting cost, I think, is the hardest thing to get around for me on this one, the 3 red. But like I said, it is a decent limited card. I think where this does really shine, though, again, is probably formats like Commander, where you have more time and more resources, and you might be able to hit a lot of targets with this and just really create chaos on the board. All right, I've been teasing this the whole time, so here it is. Jacques is back, and we have a Chinese traditional spoiler of it. On the left side is another copy of Jacques, just for context if you're not familiar with the card. It is 1 red, it's an instant, and deals 2 damage to target creature or player. This is a common, this is going to be everywhere. This is an extremely powerful card, and this really lowers the stock in a lot of 2 toughness or 1 toughness creatures, and there's a lot of them out there. I mean, all week we've been seeing really good 1 and 2 toughness creatures that have great abilities. There's some good ones in Kaladesh too. So this entering the format really changes the game quite a bit. If you're not familiar with this card, the last time it was printed in a standard format was Magic 2014, and that's been quite some time now. This was originally kind of like the fixed lightning bolt, and come to find out, even the fixed lightning bolt wasn't completely fixed. It's still very, very powerful, and that's why we haven't seen printed in so long in Standard. So this is a game changer. This is a big deal. I also like the art on here and what they did with it. So very interesting. This is a very high draft pick in Limited. This is going to take care of a lot of problems for you that are out there in the Limited game. And yes, this will see Standard play as well. All right, next card comes to us from a Russian language spoiler. It's Hidden Stocks. It costs a white, a black. It's an enchantment. It has Revolt. At the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, create a 1/1 colorless servo token. And you can pay 1 and sacrifice a creature, and you'll get to scry 1. This is interesting to me. The reason I'm intrigued by this card is it only costs 2. Granted, it is 2 different colors. But it does open up the possibility, as long as you can hit the Revolt trigger, to amass some tokens and or scry pretty consistently. And scrying is a powerful thing. It's easier to scry in blue and red than it is in black and white. So that's another reason I'm a little bit intrigued by this card, because it does something that, not to say black and white don't scry, because they do, but blue and red seem to at least recently be the go-to for scry, or at least the stronger scry colors. So this does something that you don't see every day in these colors. So having said all of that, I don't know what that means exactly. Like, could there be a black-white token strategy in Standard, or maybe even a Modern deck that tries to play something like this or sprinkle it in there? I don't know, maybe. Maybe not, but I do like where this is going, and I would like to test this one out, I guess. If I could try this one out, just see how it feels, how it plays, there could be some potential to this card. As far as Limited goes, I do think it's actually really cool in Limited. Like, I'd be happy to try this out there, and I think, as long as you can hit the Revolt trigger, this can do a lot for you in a game of Limited. All right, next is a Russian language card again, and this one is Outland Bore. It costs 2, a red, a green. It's a boar, 4/4, and can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. It almost feels like a boar, kind of, doesn't it? So anyway, here's the thing about this card. I think this is fine in Limited. Like, happy to play it. Just a nice little Limited beater. Not a whole lot more to say about it. But just an interesting side note, the can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less is kind of like Wizards' modern way of testing a more simplified trample. We kind of saw this with Regeneration earlier, and I think that was in the last set, if I'm not mistaken. But they were testing a new way to regenerate, which is basically pay 1 to make something indestructible, as opposed to the whole regeneration rule set thing. So this is kind of like their simplified trample. Now, they haven't gone all in on this. I mean, we still see trample creatures in this particular set, but I at least find it interesting. So maybe at lower rarities, you'll see this instead of trample. I don't know, but I don't know. It's interesting. I like trample. I don't think trample is super confusing. I do think regeneration confuses a lot of new players. Trample gets a little confusing when you start mixing it with other stuff like Death Touch or First Strike or something, but quite honestly, I don't think it's that bad. So I don't know if this is necessarily something that they'll keep doing in the future or not, but it's interesting. Just wanted to point it out. Next, we have Renegade Rallier. This costs a white, a green, and 1. It's a human warrior 3/2 with Revolt. And when this enters the battlefield, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, return target permanent card with converted mana cost 2 or less from a graveyard to the battlefield. I like this one a lot. Yes, it's 2 toughness, a little bit fragile, could die to a few different things, but only costs 3. And if you can hit that Revolt trigger, going to your graveyard to take something small, but notice it is a permanent, not just creature. So you can get a land or whatever else you want to get that's 2 or less and put it right into play. I think that's actually pretty awesome. This card, I think, is quite good. 3/2 has decent stats as well, as far as if you want to go a little bit aggro early game. So I like this. I think it's strong enough to see some Standard play. Again, I think we've seen some good Selesnya cards so far in this set and some good Rakdos cards. So I'm expecting, at least I hope, that the face of Standard will start to change a little bit when this set comes out. But yeah, I think this card could see Standard play, and very good in Limited too. Next, we have a card that comes to us from a Russian language spoiler. It's Weldfest Engineer. It costs 1, black, and red. It's a human artificer. At the beginning of your combat phase, target artifact creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. It's a 3/3. So another good Rakdos card. This has some decent power and toughness for 3, being a 3/3. And also, that ability just happens on your combat phase. It isn't a Revolt trigger. You're almost used to seeing Revolt in front of all this stuff by now, but no, this is just a regular old trigger, and it interacts very well with things like Smuggler's Copter, right? And I think just because of interactions like that will make the standard playable. So watch out for this card. It interacts with very powerful artifacts that are already in the format. Next we have Cogwork Assembler. This costs 3. It's an artifact creature, assembly worker, 2/3, and the ability pays 7. Create a token that's a copy of target artifact. That token gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of your next end step. I like this card a lot in Limited. First off, it's an assembly worker, so it plays well with Self-Assembler. It's kind of sad that in Draft we only have 1 pack of Kaladesh to find Self-Assemblers, because now we finally have some targets for them. But this is a fine target, but even if that's not the case, paying 3 for a 2/3 is good enough in Limited a lot of the times, and later on in a grindy matchup, I can pay 7, copy one of my artifacts, get in there for some extra damage, and then exile it. I think it's actually a pretty cool long game effect. So yeah, I don't mind playing it there. Not too much more for me to say about it than that. I do like the art though. The art looks really nice. Alright, next card comes to us from a German language spoiler. It's Walking Baralista. This costs 2x, and it's an artifact construct. This enters the battlefield, of course, with X+1/+1 counters. You can pay 4 to put an extra counter on, or you can remove a counter. If you do, it will deal 1 damage to target creature or player. It comes in as a 0/0. Alright, so, I don't know. They all can't be Hangerback Walker. This card, I feel like it's just a little too slow. I mean, I like the fact that it can ping creature or player. I like the versatility there. But I feel like you have to have a fair amount of mana to put into this before it really starts to do anything great for you. Now, granted, in Limited, I still think it's a great card. Like, you do have a lot of 1-2 toughness creatures out there that are very strong. This card helps keep those in check. So I think this is great in Limited. Very fine card there. I think it's a little too slow for Standard or anything like that. I think it could be fun in Commander too if you want to play around with it. Again, you could put a lot of resources into a card like this. If you had a lot of mana to pump into it, it becomes a lot better. So just something to consider. But overall, like, if nothing else, you'll play this in Limited and be fine with it. Alright, next we have a cycle to look at, and these are very interesting. The first one is Implement of Combustion. It costs 1, it's an artifact. You pay a red, sacrifice it, it will deal 1 damage to target player, and when this is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. Alright, so these are commons, and I'm going to tell you right off the bat, all 5 of these cards, they're basically Revolt enablers. Like, there's not a lot for me to say about them. Their abilities are not super exciting. Some are a little better than others. This is maybe one of the worst ones. Because notice this doesn't hit creatures, only hits a player. If it could hit a creature, that might not be the worst thing in the world, but hitting a player for 1, I mean, it really is doing nothing. All you're doing here is just simply, hopefully having a nice revolt trigger out of this, and at least it replaces itself at that point. So that's pretty much the story behind all 5 of these. The next one may be the best one of the bunch. Implement of Examination. This one costs 3. They're making you pay a little more for it. But for 1 blue, you get to draw a card and sacrifice it. And then, again, when it goes to graveyard, you get to draw a card. So you pay a blue and 3 to draw 2 cards. It replaces itself, and then you get to draw a card. That's not that bad. And compared to the other 4, this is probably the best one of the bunch. Again, in a vacuum, if I'm just doing a draft and I had to choose between one of the 5, this would be the one I'd take. But again, it's more about the Revolt trigger than anything else here. Next, we have Implement of Ferocity. It costs 1 artifact. Pay green, sacrifice it, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. And then, of course, again, if it goes to the graveyard, you draw a card. So they don't even want you to be able to leave this up to make combat more difficult for your opponent. They just want you to straightforward play this, get the counter, get the revolt trigger, and go about your day. So that's really all this is. And again, it could be interesting in some Limited decks because there does appear to be a Simic +1/+1 counter sub-theme going on at least. And maybe it works well in some of those decks. So this one might be a little better than some of the others, but there it is at face value. Next we have Implement of Improvement. This one costs 1. Pay a white, sacrifice it, you gain 2 life, and then you get to draw a card when it goes to the graveyard. So yeah, again, not very exciting, gaining 2 life. And finally, the last one, Implement of Malice, costs 2. Pay a black, sacrifice it, target player discards a card. Of course, activate this ability only anytime you can cast a sorcery, and then you get to draw the card when it goes to the graveyard. So, yeah, not super exciting again, especially if you're allowing your opponent to decide what to discard. It's not random or something like that. But like I said, again, this is more about the Revolt trigger than anything else. They want to be able to enable that mechanic well in Limited games. And that's what these cards do. So I guess they kind of meet that requirement, if nothing else. Having said that, guess what? Those are all the cards for today. So quite a few, as always. This has been a really big week. Tomorrow we'll be back with another video recapping everything that happens within the next 24 hours. So join us then. And once we get the full set revealed, we'll begin our full set review as we always do. So until then, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. And have a great day. Hey, thanks as always for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.